Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
The finding of his DNA wasn't just on the murder weapon, it was on a most important part of the murder weapon.
This evidence was the breakthrough that we needed.
The forensic evidence in this case was crucial.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science brought the most dangerous killers to justice.
A truly horrific criminal, a monster.
It's a hammer blow. You don't know how you're going to carry on.
We'll hear how some of the most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
He basically said to me, she's in the house, go and find her.
The amount of blood that was there indicated that there was a frenzied attack.
There was no reasonable explanation for them. That's why he changed his plea.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
The key thing about having a DNA profile is you've got probably the sharpest tool in the box.
I was so elated beforehand. We didn't have the evidence, and all of a sudden, we'd cracked it.
In this episode, a horrific discovery on a picturesque beach.
It wasn't a normal crime scene because it was by the shore, and the police had to take into account the fact that the tide was coming in.
A finding that shocked police and the community of a small seaside town.
Some little girls had come across whilst playing on the beach, a head and hands. They didn't know where the rest of the body was.
And a brazen killer caught on CCTV.
He's swinging it as he's walking along the road.
This is forensics, catching the killer.
It was April the 1st, 2008, and it was on a morning not unlike this in terms of weather conditions. Very quiet. The school holidays were on at the time, so two sisters who lived nearby were on the beach, and they came down to play. And they saw something that aroused their curiosity. It was a bag, a plastic bag that had been washed up on shore. They decided to have a look at it. And what was inside filled them with horror.
Inside a supermarket carrier bag, wrapped in a bin liner, was a human head.
One can only wonder about what effect this had on these little girls, because to have made this sort of discovery as an adult would be traumatic enough. I think at the time, even their mother, because it was April the 1st, might have thought that it was some sort of hoax, but it soon became apparent that it wasn't. And the police were called, they came down here and very rapidly closed off the area. It became a major crime scene.
I received a call from the control room saying that two little girls had found what they thought was a head on the beach at Arbroath, and we were asked to attend.
Bob Sterling was a detective constable for Tayside Police at the time.
When I arrived there on South Street in Arbroath, I met up with two uniformed officers who were guarding the scene. So I made my way to the actual site and saw a black plastic bag. I gave it a cursory examination, and I could just see through it, I could see human hair, and decided that this was real.
The beach was cordoned, and dozens of police were called in to search for more clues.
We were waiting on the identification branch to arrive, and I tasked one of the uniform officers to go and have a look to see if there was anything else before they actually arrived, and that's about maybe 50, 60, 70 yards away. He found another black bin liner with a pair of hands inside.
Word would have got round very, very quickly about what had happened here, and there's no doubt about it, this would have reverberated right throughout the county of Angus. To have body parts found on the beach would have set tongues wagging in a big way.
This is a friendly town, small compared to other places. And we just cannot believe that such a thing is happening in our town.
What was normally a quiet bit of beach here at Arbroath was transformed into a crime scene, and the police erected a tarpaulin. Forensics officers were on the scene. So it was a very much different look to what locals would normally see here. It wasn't a normal crime scene because it was by the shore, and the police had to take into account the fact that the tide was coming in. It was bringing all sorts of detritus in with it, so they had to make sure that they did what they could almost immediately in terms of searching and also in terms of cordoning off the area. But they had to gather evidence as quickly as they could before it was destroyed.
For forensic pathologist David Sadler, the fast-approaching tide meant not visiting the crime scene as standard practice would usually require.
Well, I first got a phone call when I was just in the office doing my routine work from an officer who was on the beach in Arbroath and said they'd come across, or some little girls had come across whilst playing on the beach, a head and hands. They didn't know where the rest of the body was. They were still looking for the rest of the body. And they were progressing their forensic investigations on the beach, and they're just running the story past me to see if I wanted to go and have a look. Although time was tight, I think the tide might have been coming in, and I got the feeling that they'd rather carry on with their own forensic investigations rather than wait for me. So it was agreed that they would bring the body parts to me later in the day, having recovered them forensically, properly, without waiting for me and risk the tide coming in.
While the forensics team continued to scour the beach for more clues, David Sadler began the post-mortem examination.
The cold water tends initially to preserve a body to some degree because it chills the body. So in a body that's drowned or even just found dead in the water from any cause, putrefaction might take a few days to get going. Cold water slows down the bacterial proliferation and it slows down the putrefactive process, which is a product of the bacteria present in and on the body. And in water, that tends to get washed away, and the cold environment tends to preserve the body to some degree until you take it out of the water. Then it seems to catch up. The fact that these body parts were quite fresh would suggest that they hadn't been in more than a day or two, and the fact that they've been detached from the body probably offered some degree of protection and preservation as well, because most of the bacteria causing putrefaction will come from the bowel and the lungs and the airways and internally and spread throughout the body via the bloodstream, whereas with the detached head there isn't really a source of bacteria within the head that can cause accelerated putrefaction.
Armed with an estimated time of death, the task now was to find out where the body parts had come from and whose they were. In April 2008, in the Scottish seaside town of Arbroath, two young sisters made a terrifying discovery. A human head washed up on the beach inside a plastic bag. And while police began a major investigation, inhabitants of the town were left in shock.
The types of crimes you'd find in Arbroath are just the typical types of crimes that you would expect in any kind of town. You've got your assaults, you obviously have some kind of violence in those areas, but it's mostly housebreakings, minor fracas that you might expect. No massive crime problem in the town at that time.
David Marsland was a reporter working for STV at the time.
People were absolutely terrified when this head was found. The two young girls who found it themselves told their mother that they were worried that whoever had done this was now going to be coming after them. But in the wider town as well, this is a genuinely horrific and shocking event, and people are asking questions, and clearly there was an impetus on what was Tayside Police then to find out who this was, what had happened to her, and who had done it.
Because the body parts had been washed up by the tide, there was speculation of how far they may have travelled. If the victim was local, it could be easier to identify her.
We did make investigation with the harbour master, and he was able to tell me that anything that's thrown from the harbour wall into the sea at that particular point will always get washed up on that beach. He more or less said there's no other possibility, high tide, low tide. If something goes in there, it always comes back onto the shore at South Street. He was quite adamant about it.
At the mortuary, pathologist David Sadler was working to establish the cause of death.
Whenever we just got a head and hands, it might be, we wouldn't necessarily expect to have the cause of death. If the deceased had been stabbed, for instance, then we'd expect to find the stab wounds on the torso, and the head might not show much. But in this case, there was enough subtle trauma to the head and face that gave us a good head start in establishing a cause of death. The head showed some signs of manual suffocation and smothering. In this case, it would appear that pressure to the mouth and nose had caused some bruising to the bridge of the nose, and also some abrasions and lacerations on the inside of the lips, where the lips have been pressed against the teeth, which would suggest manual pressure to the mouth and nose in a smothering and suffocation mechanism. Although we didn't have the usual signs of asphyxia, which is florid petechial hemorrhages around the eyes and the face, which we often see with compression of the neck, which causes the engorgement, and it shows the showers of petechial hemorrhages will appear in the eyes. We didn't have that, but we don't expect to see that with a smothering because we don't get the pressure on the neck, we just have the pressure on the mouth and nose.
This is Arbroath Police Station. This is the scene where the incident room was placed. All the officers that were involved in it more or less worked from here, because this is the centre of the, obviously, investigation.
Initially, a photograph was taken of the head once it had been at the mortuary, and it was brought back to Arbroath Police Office and put on the incident board where the room was set up for the inquiry. And a female officer looked at it and thought she recognised the woman as being someone who'd assisted in an inquiry about a month before in Brechin. She thought she recognised the person as being a migrant worker who assisted as an interpreter in a previous inquiry, and she thought her name was Jolanta Bladaiti.
Jolanta Bladaiti was a 35-year-old Lithuanian woman who had moved to Scotland for work in 2006.
This woman had assisted in trying to identify who had perpetrated a robbery in Brechin about a month before on another migrant worker. And this is how this policewoman thought this was who it was. And she knew where she stayed and where she worked, because she worked in the agricultural industry. So inquiries, I think, were then made with her boss, who positively identified Jolanta Bladaiti.
So who was Jolanta?
Certainly at the time before Brexit, this area was a magnet for migrant workers, particularly from Eastern Europe, because they came here to make money in the berry fields and on other farms as well. Made money here during the summer and returned home during the winter.
It's a migrant community of, at that time, it would have been about 4,000 people, so effectively everybody knew everybody.
Jolanta came from Lithuania, and she came from a rural area of Lithuania, and she had really a very sort of poverty-stricken upbringing. At some point, she apparently was inspired by her sister, who had gone to live in Moscow, to travel abroad. So she did that, and I think about 2006 she went across to Ireland, then she came to Cornwall, and then she came up to Scotland. And I think the aim was to raise as much money as she could through working on farms to help support her parents, but there was also a suggestion that she wanted to get as much money as she could to go back to live in her home country and buy a place for herself.
She saved her cash, she did everything she could. She was extremely frugal, despite sending money back home to her sick father, who was dying from cancer. And she'd finally just about reached the level she needed for her deposit. She was planning to return home to Lithuania, buy that flat that she'd been looking for, when she was very brutally murdered.
With a name for the victim, police attention was drawn 14 miles away to Brechin, where Jolanta lived. Forensic scientist Alistair Burt was called in to examine her flat.
It was a first floor flat, had to go up past the half landing into the bed set. There was about 4 bed sets and a communal bathroom. All the furniture was in its normal place, and the flat looked relatively undisturbed. I examined a number of the rooms for blood. When I got to the bathroom, we discovered watery blood stains under the carpet and in the bath. And that was the likely site where the body had been dismembered. You had to look quite carefully. You couldn't really see the bloodstains particularly well on the upper side of the carpet, but you could see them more clearly on the floorboards underneath. And we have a chemical test that you can use if you see a suspect stain. You can test it, and then there's a colour reaction if in the presence of blood. And that was a positive colour reaction that we got from the stains in the
under the carpet and in the bath itself.
Forensics also uncovered shocking evidence that Jolanta may have been tortured before she was killed.
There was a cupboard on the half landing up to the first floor, and in there the crime scene investigators found numerous lengths of tape that we subsequently discovered had been used to bind her, and a lot of that must have been wrapped around her head because there was numerous long human head hairs present on the tape. When hair has been forcibly removed, such as when it's been taped and then the tape has been pulled off, it removes the hair, including a sheath cell on the hair, and we were able to get a DNA profile that matched that of the victim. Also, there was a complete roll of tape, and I think there was a physical fit between the tape that was discovered in the bin cupboard and the roll of tape, so that you could say that that tape came from that particular roll.
Forensics could now prove Jolanta had been tortured and then killed inside the flat. Outside, police discovered more forensic evidence as to who might have been the killer.
The police officers checked the bins, as they routinely do, to see if there's been any discarded items of interest, and they discovered overalls that were blood-stained, and we were able to get a DNA profile.
While the forensic team continued to search the building, detectives made door-to-door inquiries to see who knew Jolanta and what the motive for her murder could be.
When police found out where Jolanta lived, they also discovered who she was living with. One of the people there was a man, a 19-year-old, called Alexandra Skarda, who Jolanta had believed to be her friend. She had known him almost all the time that she had been in Arbroath. He had overheard her talking about the money that she had saved and her excitement that she was going to be going home to buy her own house, which is something that she'd always wanted to do. That's why she was in Scotland.
Witnesses told police that Skarda had recently been seen hanging around with another man, 40-year-old Vitas Plitnikas. Could these two men help reveal how and why Jolanta had been killed? April 2008. Dismembered body parts found washed up on Arbroath Beach have been identified as that of Lithuanian agricultural worker Jolanta Bladaitė. With evidence mounting and witnesses placing them at the scene, two fellow Lithuanians, Alexandra Skarda and Vitas Plitnikas, were taken into custody.
There was forensic evidence found in the flat, blood staining, etc., and the plastic bags are found similar to the ones that had been found on the beach. And I had a receipt that was found as well regarding the purchase of the bags in a shop in Brechin. They were subsequently interviewed separately.
DNA swabs were taken from the suspects and compared to blood samples and overalls found in Jolanta's flat.
We weren't looking specifically for DNA that matched Skarda at the crime scene, because you'd expect to find that anyway, given that he lived there. So we looked for things that are out of the ordinary. We got blood stains on the outside of the overalls which matched that of Jolanta, and we also managed to get DNA profiles from the inside of the overalls, where people are likely to leave DNA if they've been wearing the overalls. And we got DNA profiles that matched that of Skarda.
When they were questioned initially, they denied any involvement, and Skirda especially had said he'd no idea where she was, and he knew her. So, but eventually it was Skirda who decided to tell the truth and gave a statement to the effect that what had happened was between the three of them in the house in Brechin, and she had been murdered, and they had cut the hands and the head off in the bathroom of the house. He was a young man, and I think the pressure just got to him, really, because he'd been interviewed so many times that he was backed into a corner. I don't think he could actually find a way out other than just eventually come away with the truth. Whereas Leonidas he was twice as old as him, and he probably thought, I could keep spinning this out as long as I can. But Skirda didn't. It was one against the other.
Plotnikas was a former Red Army soldier, and there were rumours that he might have been involved in the war in Afghanistan all these years ago. But he just looked like a pretty fearsome character. And on the other hand, Skirda was much younger, only 19 years old. He looked like butter might not melt in his mouth.
The two of them hatched a plot to kill Jolanta Bladaite and take all that money that she had worked so hard to earn. They had a time pressure on them because she was about to leave Scotland to go home to Lithuania.
I think they believed that Jolanta had somewhere in the region of £7,000 in her bank account, a TSB account, and they fully intended to get as much of that as they possibly could. I think their idea was to try and do withdrawals before and after midnight so they can get the maximum amount.
Police then set about tracking their movements around the time of Jolanta's murder.
It was a couple of days, before we got all the downloads and had a look at it and see what He was actually quite easy to identify because he had a pronounced limp. And the pair of them just were completely mismatched. They were like 20 years apart and different heights and builds, etc. So once you'd seen them, you could quite easily identify them walking through the town.
CCTV showed the pair travelling for well over an hour by bus, carrying the plastic bag that contained Jolanta's severed head.
They got the bus from Brechin to a little village called Freecombe, and then got another connecting bus from Freecombe to Arbroath. And they get off the bus, Catherine Street in Arbroath, and they're seen walking down the road, and it's Skirda that has the head, and he's swinging it as he's walking along the road. But Leonidas is walking on crutches at this point due to an injury that he had previously when he'd been a soldier in the Russian army. And then they went down towards the harbour and threw the head in the water in the hands.
And then they were seen again on CCTV, this time transporting a suitcase.
The next day they got a lift from another friend of theirs who took them in his car with the suitcase in it.
Liddell's car park is just at the back of the police station there, and that's where the car was. They dropped off with the suitcase. The car parked and they dropped off with the suitcase, and then walked in that direction to head towards the harbour.
Just like Skirda and Plitnikas had done with the carrier bag holding Jolanta's head, they tossed the suitcase containing the rest of her body weighed down with bricks off the harbour wall.
I think the pair of them probably very inexperienced in sort of tidal matters and what have you. Would assume that anything would be swept right out, which wasn't the case. I think it was just basic naivety as far as they're concerned regarding that.
Police divers went into the water there, and they quite quickly found the suitcase with Jolanta's torso in it that had been thrown in. Well, part of the thinking of Plitnikas and Skirda was that if they dismembered Jolanta's body, they would effectively make her disappear and perhaps make people think that she'd earned enough money, she'd reached the target, and that she'd gone home to Lithuania.
Other witnesses were found who'd sort of seen them in the area, and they got hold of the guy who drove the car with a suitcase in it, and he gave a statement to that effect.
The second find of the torso really didn't add very much in terms of the cause or mechanism of death. We were fairly happy with the cause of death from our examination of the head. So really it was a case of just completing the anatomy really and putting the body back together. So at least now we had a complete find and a complete body, and that's important to have a complete body to give back to the relatives. That in itself was a success.
Alexander Skirda was not really all that well known to the police, but Plitnikas definitely was. He was a disqualified driver, and he dabbled in a lot of things, petty thefts, etc. So he was known, without a doubt.
As more evidence mounted against the two, Skirda divulged further information during his police interview.
Plitnikas had money worries. He wasn't working, and he wasn't claiming he didn't get any state benefit. But it was basically just he didn't have much at all, and that was the reason that it was carried out. Skirda didn't have any money either. He was quite poor.
There was evidence that someone had been using her bank card, and it turned out that they'd tortured Jolanta to give them her PIN number so they could take money out of her account.
Under further questioning, Skirda revealed more about what had been done to Jolanta before she died.
Skirda was the one who broke first, really. He did admit how the poor woman had been assaulted in the house and made to give up the PIN number. Initially, she gave him the wrong PIN number, and Plitnikas had gone out to try and get money from a shop not far from where they stayed. It obviously didn't work, and he came back in a rage, and eventually she gave up her PIN number, and they did get some money. But then, at this time, they decided that was it. She wasn't going to survive, and they made the conscious decision to kill her.
One can only imagine the terror felt by Jolanta when these two men burst into her room on that Saturday morning. There was quite a contrast between the brutish appearance of Plitnikas and the younger, more baby-faced look of Alexandra Skirda. Quite a contrast, but the fact that both these men carried out this murder says a lot.
A young woman brutally killed for her hard-earned savings. DNA from the blood found at Jolanta's flat, CCTV footage, and Skirda's confession meant police could now charge the pair with murder. On the 7th of April 2008, less than a week after the discovery of the dismembered remains of Jolanta Bladaiti, two men, Alexandras Skierda and Vitas Plitnikas, were charged with her murder. Detectives now had to compile enough proof to convict them both, but they faced one significant challenge.
We didn't find any DNA evidence to link Plitnikas to the crime scene at all. We suspected that his clothing had been cleaned. We had a mass of clothing to examine from Plitnikas, but we didn't find any DNA that matched that of Jolanta.
Plitnikas was only implicated through the CCTV evidence showing the pair disposing of the body parts, and despite that, he continued to deny any involvement. But in the end, the most compelling evidence against Plitnikas came from his own accomplice.
Trial took place at Edinburgh High Court. Skierda tendered a plea of guilty and gave evidence in the witness box against his co-accused, Vitas Plitnikas.
It was a slow case because everything had to be translated into Lithuanian, so it took quite a while. Skierda had implicated Plitnikas in the murder, and I was called to give evidence to help corroborate Skierda's story. Forensics were very important in this case because we were able to show that Jolanta had been killed and dismembered in her own bedsit. There was the bloodstains that were found in the bathroom, and they subsequently matched that of the victim. And we were also able to find that she'd been tied up or bound with tape because we found her hairs, or hairs that matched her at least, on the tape. We were also able to find overalls that were likely to have been worn by Skierda, and we were able to find blood that matched Jolanta on those overalls. If a person is found with bloodstains on their clothing and it matches that of the victim, then that's useful in securing a conviction. It depends on the circumstances, obviously. If the suspect said that they were helping the victim or had some reason to have the blood of someone else on their clothing, then that could be a possible explanation.
But there was no such explanation from Skierda as to why Jolanta's blood was on his overalls.
Skierda and Plitnikas were very different in court. Skierda, just a teenager, had broken down while being interrogated by police. It was Skierda who had confessed. It was Skierda who told them what they'd done. It was Skierda who had implicated Plitnikas. And inside court, he was humble. He was trying to give evidence. He was trying to explain what had happened under cross-examination, sometimes quite aggressive cross-examination. He had been relatively consistent in his story. Plitnikas, a former soldier in the Russian army, was belligerent. He was bullish. He lied in court. He claimed he wasn't there. He had this special defense of alibi, saying that he wasn't anywhere near the Brecon flat where Jolanta Bladaiti had been murdered. The jury saw through that pretty quickly.
At the conclusion of the trial, Plitnikas was found guilty and given a sentence of 28 years. He was subsequently deported. Skierda eventually ended up being given an 18-year sentence, which I believe he's still serving in Scotland.
Because of his cooperation with the police and trial, Skierda received a minimal life sentence. But Plitnikas showed no remorse for his brutal crime.
The This will never be forgotten. In the annals of major criminal cases in Scotland, this is up near the top, and people here will forever associate this particular beach with this poor woman from Lithuania, a couple of thousand miles at least from her home, who met this dreadful fate. And I think the overall feeling about this is, amongst the community, is incredible sadness that it happened in the first place.
And it was that community that came together after Jolanta's death to support her family and pay tribute to the woman who had been washed up on the beach.
One of the tragic things about this case is that Jolanta Blodaity's father, who she had been sending money home to because he was being treated for cancer, died before the verdict was made. And her family, who were impoverished, were unable to get to Scotland. And so they had a spokesperson there, a friend of Jolanta's from Brecon, who spoke about the family's grief at the loss of this wonderful woman. And that, plus the circumstances of her death, really affected the people of Brecon and Arbroath and the county of Angus, where those two towns lie. And there was a fundraiser because her family couldn't bring Jolanta home. And it raised around about £16,000. Just the ordinary people of Arbroath and Brecon and surrounding areas putting their money in to send this Lithuanian girl home. It's quite a remarkable thing.
Following the memorial and fundraiser, Jolanta's remains were repatriated back to her family. And she was finally buried there, in her hometown of Alytus.